Hello everyone, my name is Jakob Alsen and I'm here today to talk about the layout package and give you a guide on the standard layouts and their common usage. So let's first start with a few words about myself. So I'm an open source philanthropist, privacy advocate and an amateur photographer in my spare time. I'm currently studying my first year of computer science and I'm also helping out in the Fyne team, doing some things here and there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on the Gopher Slack at Jackals, and you can find my GitHub on github.com/jackals. But let's get into the real things here now, or the interesting things. So let's first talk about the layout package and more specifically how the layouts are defined. So if you look at the interface to the right in the top image, you'll see that the layout interface has two methods. The first one is the layout method, which takes a slice of canvas objects and a size as parameters. And this is what you use to position the resize and move widgets in the size that it is given into this layout. So if this layout has, say, 1000 by 1000 units to work in, you'll know that size inside the layout function where you try to resize your widgets or resize your widgets. And here it's worth noting that the layouting of widgets and canvas objects works from the window down. So if you have the whole window, the first container is going to get that part of the screen to function and then to render in, and then any layouts further down will just be able to render inside that part of the screen. But this means that you're not doing the kind of fixed size widget that you usually do. Everything is trying to work together in a way that works across different screen sizes and mobile and so on. But before diving into the actual layouts, I need to mention how we use these layouts. And this is where the container package comes in. So a container is a way to group together canvas objects and optionally use it with or without a layout. So in most cases you'll want to use a layout, and then you use the container.new function and then pass a layout as the first parameter, and then any following parameters will take canvas objects. And there are also shorthands for the layout package, so you can create a container with the specific layout. You don't necessarily need to create a new container and then pass the layout. And so if you're using a VBox layout, you can do the container.new VBox instead of the above there. They'll do exactly the same thing, it's just a bit less to write. And if you don't want to have a layout that handles the size and position of objects, and you want to do it manually, you can do a container.new without layout. So let's jump into the first layout. And in our case, this is the horizontal box, or H box for short. And it works in the sense that you add objects to the right of each other. So the first object is going to be the one that you see here, and then the second will be here, and the third will be here. And all the objects here are rendered at their minimum size, or the minimum width of their minimum size. And this is important because, as you see in the image here, the first item has this min size, so it's going to take up this portion, this part has this size, and this part has this size. But it doesn't resize to make the rest of the window, it doesn't take up the rest of the window. This is a common mistake when someone passes, for example, an image which maybe doesn't have a big mini size. Then this image is going to be very small and it's not going to be displayed. So you have to make sure that you're using the correct layout. But there are other layouts for that. We'll talk more about that later. So on to the sibling of the horizontal box, the vertical box. And it works basically the same, but instead of adding from left to right, we're adding from top to bottom. So the first item is going to be, for example, this username entry, and then the second, the password, and so on. And again, objects are rendered at their minimum height. So this means that, again, if you pass, for example, a list, the list is going to have the minimum size of a little bit more than a first object. So you're not going to get a big list. Be aware of that. And there are, of course, use cases where that makes a lot of sense. But now on to the grid. And here we see a more specialized layout, I'd say, because it allows us to do some clever things that we'll showcase in the future. But in large, the grid positions objects in a grid pattern with a set amount of rows or column. If you, for example, use the layout constructor here with the new grid layout with columns, and you set that to 2 columns, 1, 2, it's always going to have 2 columns as long as you pass enough objects, enough canvas objects to populate more than 1 column or so. And all these elements will get scaled so that all objects are the same size while keeping the amount of rows and columns the same. This basically means that this object is going to be the same size as this object, and when you're resizing, it's not going to add more rows and not more columns. And if this is something that you would have wanted, then you can move on to the grid wrap. And with the grid wrap, it's basically a grid, but instead of saying I want this many columns or I want this many rows, you set a fixed size for the objects, and any items that don't fit on the current row will drop down and populate the next row. And you might have seen this before in, for example, file managers, where you have a lot of icons in an icon view, and when you resize the window, they pop up to the row below, or above, I mean, sorry. So what happens in this example when we resize the window so that the third object can fit on the first line? It's going to move up into that spot. Fancy. Now I want to just take a sidestep from our layouts and talk about the first thing that isn't a layout. And this is the spacer. It's not used as a layout, but it's used inside other layouts to help control and position the size and position of other objects, mostly position. So we'll most likely see it used in grids or VBox containers, but you can of course use it in any container that you want. And in the example here, there is a spacer here, which spaces out the first part of a grid. So 1 row, second row, the third row. And then in this second row, there's a spacer, something here, a spacer, columns, I mean. And then in the last row here, there's a spacer. So this is very useful, but we're going to talk more about that in a code example in the end of the presentation. Now, let's talk about the center layout. And it's just as you might have expected. It puts things in the center of the available space for the container. And these objects are again rendered at their minimum size, so you have to make sure that you don't have a tiny min size that is not going to display anything at all on the screen. Now, maybe the most used layout in oh, never mind. It's one of my favorite layouts either way, and it's what serves the base for the form widget. And the special thing with the form layout is that it's basically what you find inside the form widget, but just you can put anything you want in the positions of the layout. So the objects in the left column are going to be compressed to their minimum size, or their width, and it's going to have the entire column is going to have the width of the largest item in that column. And you'll most likely see it used with, for example, labels in the left side and entries in the right column, where the right columns is expanded to take up all of the available space to the right. And of course the form widget also has some features, like Andrew talked about, that are not in the form layout. Then we have the border layout, which allows objects to be rendered at the borders. So top, bottom, left and right. And then there's also a section in the middle where you can position items. And the thing here to note is that all the objects in the borders, or at the borders maybe, are rendered at their minimum size, while the remaining item inside the middle, or items, will take up all of the available space. So if you, for example, you don't need to pass all of the borders here. You can pass a nil to any one of these, and for example get the example here where you have an item in the top and one on the left. Then the central item is going to take up all of the available space that is left. Also, a little gotcha here that we need to make note of is that with the border layout you have to pass a reference to the canvas object twice. So if you want an entry in the top part here, you'll have to pass the entry into the layout here, and then you also need to pass the entry into the container, because when the layout then looks through the slice of canvas objects, it needs to see that, oh, this is the entry that should be at the top. Well, then I position it at the top. This is something that you don't have to worry about if you use the container.new border, but it's worth having in mind if you use the layout package directly. Now, let's talk about maybe one of the most boring layouts, I guess, but it's also very useful. This is the max layout. It just positions and sizes objects to fill the entire available space. And this is of course the default for a window unless another layout is used. If you just pass an entry to window.setContent, it's going to take up all of the available space. And a little useful tip with the max layout is that if you pass it more than one object, and for example one of these objects are transparent, you can show them above each other, or have transparent parts I should say, you can show them above each other, as in this example, with a black rectangle with a green circle above. And again, with what I said before, with how the space is allocated from top down, you can't put a max layout inside a container several positions down, because it's not going to like take up all of the window when this max layout is inside a container that only has a set amount of that window available to draw in. Now, last but not least, when we talk about our layouts, we have the paddle layout. And this is a relatively new addition. It basically works as a max layout, but instead of drawing it exactly at the maximum size, it adds a small bit of padding around the edges. And this padding size is controlled by the theme. So it can be useful if you, for example, want to avoid having objects be right at the edge of each other. So with these 9 layouts and a spacer, you might be thinking, well, these are relatively simple layouts. How can we make something advanced and with a very useful interface? And this is where combining layouts comes in. So a container is also a canvas object. So you can pass another container into a container to basically have them work together to build up an entire user interface. So I'm going to do a short example here on how we can combine layouts to make a login screen that looks good on both desktop and on mobile. And the result here is going to be what you see for the left side for a desktop application and the right side for a mobile application. So if we bring up the text example here, or the example folder, I mean, we can bring up our main.go file. So this is what we have as a baseline. We create our app, our new window, and then I just have a username, a password, and a login widget. They're not that type of widget, but so the username and password are entries, of course, and the login is a button. And then I do the app.driver.device.isMobile function or methods to allow us to control different layouts when we have different, if we are desktop on or mobile. So if we just open up our example here, which I compiled it beforehand, we'll see that we have this section in the middle, and the widget can be this small at smallest. So how would we do to accomplish this? Let's start with a container dot new grid with rows. So if you look at this, like, we have a grid with 3 rows. So we can pass this a 3. It's also worth bearing in mind here that we could just as well have used a VBox in this case, but using a VBox would have allowed the window to become this size as smallest. I prefer doing it this way, but you can do however you want. There are many ways to combine layouts. So we have that section figured out. If we have a layout.newSpacer, we'll get this grid item to be a spacer. And then we can focus on this part. How do we do that? Well, if we see this as a grid with 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, we can do a container.new grid with columns and pass a 3 into that. And inside this grid, we want to have a spacer. And then we want this section. So if you think about this, we have a username entry above a password entry above a login button. We can use a VBox, container.new VBox. So we have our username, password and login here, so we can take username and then we can pass the password and then we can pass the login button. So that's this part. Now if we want to, now we need a spacer in this part. And to round this off, we need this part. So let's see, where do we have that ends there? So we want container dot new, no, I'm just kidding, a layout dot new spacer. And of course that, I'll just pass that until then. So what do we have? If we run, let's first say we have the grid container with 3 rows, we have a spacer, we had a grid with 3 columns, a spacer, a container, VBox container, a spacer, and then ending out with a spacer. So if we build this, we have a layouts binary, and then we do layouts, and there we have the user interface all compiled and working. So the thing with using grids here is that if you had a VBox in this section, you would compress the username entries here and the button to be as small as possible, which would make them very hard to type, and as you expand the window they would not expand like this, and that is why I have a grid in that sense. But if we, for example, change this into a VBox, you'd see that it would build just as well, but it would be this small by default, but it would look basically the same, or it would look the same when you make the window bigger. So now on to the mobile layout. So this is what we want, and if we just think about this, we can use a VBox with a spacer, the username, the password, a login button, and then a spacer. So to do that, we just do new VBox, and then we, inside that, we put a layout.new spacer, username, password, login, and with that we can run go build tags mobile, and this is our mobile simulator. It works on Linux and Mac OS at the moment, I think. It does not work on Windows. It most likely works on BSDs as well. So if we run our layouts now, we get this mobile version. So that's the example of combining layouts to create a login screen that works good on mobile and desktop. Now, of course, you need to put this all into good use. So for the API reference of the layout package, you can check out the developer.fyne.io API reference site for it, which of course I see now should be 2.1. But I don't think the layout package has changed anything in 2.1, so you'll be fine. You can scan the QR codes above the top QR code for that API reference, and there's also a frequently asked questions section about layouts and widget size on the developer.fyne.io site as well, which you can use the below QR code for. So now I want to see your great layouts and how you can combine them. Thanks for listening.